The Man Who Went Up and Never Came Down. From Motorcyclist to Mystic. The day dawned like any other. There were no portents, no prophetic dreams. 23rd September 1982. It was a busy weekday in Juggy's life. He had a regular breakfast, of upma he recalls, when I ask him if he remembers such trivia about an otherwise momentous day, and made his way to a work meeting. A major contract had been signed a few days ago, and he and his business partner had much to discuss. In the afternoon, he dropped off his partner for a brief siesta. Juggy then went home for lunch. He still remembers the main dish that afternoon. Basada saru, a Karnataka specialty which has an Andhra variant, at which his mother excelled. It was now 2:30. There was time to kill before the next meeting. A motorcycle ride was Juggy's inevitable choice. He had acquired his first motorcycle a couple of years ago. After riding a bicycle in his school days, and stealthily appropriating his father's scooter and brother's motorcycle in his high school and college years, the Yezdi motorcycle was now his prized possession. He maintained it with fanatical zeal, and kept it in prime position. He now had several friends who were motorcycle fiends, and shared some of his passion for wild adventure. But no one else was quite as determined about seeing the adventures through to their end. If Juggy decided one night he wanted to go to Goa, he set out at once. There was no question of waiting for others to join him. Planning, as Juggy knew, meant endless procrastination, and he had no patience with that. People are willing to walk with you only as far as it's convenient, he says. When their comfort zone is crossed, they drop off. Very few go all the way. But I've always been one of those who go all the way once I commit myself. His snake and motorbike fetish, coupled with his daredevil temperament, had earned him the tag of Deadly Juggy among his friends. It's not that I was impulsive. I was just life-oriented, he says. I measured the consequences of my actions. It's just that the more dangerous they were, the more they attracted me. Someone once told me my guardian angel must be very good and perpetually working overtime. There was always in me a longing to test the border, to cross the edge. What and why were never questions for me. How was the only question. When I look back now, I realize that I never thought about what I wanted to become in life. I only thought about how I wanted to live my life, and I knew that the how could be determined within yourself and by yourself. The favorite destination for young Mysoreans was Chamundi Hill, a mandatory halt on every tourist itinerary, famous for its panoramic view of the city and its picturesque Shakti temple of Chamundeshwari, the tutelary deity of the Mysore Maharajas. Juggy knew the hill intimately. He had been there on jaunts since he was a child. It was there that he had been bitten by a venomous snake many years ago. It was down these slopes that he had careened wildly on his motorcycle, eventually plunging to the bottom, bruised and bleeding. In recent times he had even conducted business meetings on the hill. Nocturnal drives and parties up there were a regular feature. For some inexplicable reason, mountains had always fascinated Juggy. From an early age, There had always been mountains in his eyes. One particular mountain dominated his vision. He didn't give it much thought. He simply assumed others too saw the similar landscape. Now, with an hour to spare before his next meeting, Jaggi turned toward Chamundi again. In Mysore there is a tradition. If you have something to do, you go to Chamundi Hill. If you have nothing to do, you go to Chamundi Hill. If you fall in love, you go to Chamundi Hill. If you fall out of love, you go to Chamundi Hill. I had recently fallen out of love, and I had nothing to do, so I went to Chamundi Hill. He sums up what happened next simply. I went up and didn't come down. When he eventually did return, it was 5 hours later. He had gone up a young, happy-go-lucky motorcyclist. He returned a mystic. I was just sitting on this particular rock, he was to say years later. I had my eyes open, not even closed. I thought it was about 10 minutes, but something began to happen to me. All my life I had thought, "This is me," pointing to himself. Suddenly I did not know which was me and which was not me. The air that I was breathing, the rock on which I was sitting, the atmosphere around me, everything had become me. The more I say, the crazier it will sound, because what was happening was indescribable. What was me had become so enormous it was everywhere. I thought this lasted a few minutes, but when I came back to my normal senses, it was about 7:30 in the evening. My eyes were open. The sun had set and it was dark. I was fully aware, but what I had considered as myself until that moment had just disappeared. When I was 8 years of age, I remember this incident very well, something happened and I cried. That day I made up my mind that I would never cry again. I should never cry. I held myself like this, showing a closed fist. And whatever situations came, I did not shed a single tear, from 8 until 25. And here I'm sitting, tears are flowing to the point where my shirt is wet, and I'm ecstatically crazy. I do not know what is happening. I have always been peaceful and happy. That's never been an issue. I've lived life the way I wanted, but here I am, drenched with a completely new kind of blissfulness. When I apply my logical mind, the only thing it can tell me is that I'm losing my balance. That's all my mind can tell me. But it is so beautiful that I don't want to lose it. Sadhguru rarely says any more than this about that afternoon on Chamundi Hill. There were no words to describe the experience. There are still none. On being pressed, however, he has alluded to the experience in oblique ways. It's like being drunk all the time without ingesting a drop of alcohol, he once remarked. On another occasion he said, "Life is all there is. There is no mountain, no flower, no cloud, nothing. It's just energy, a raw pulsating mass of energy. You can call that the creator or creation, or you can call it yourself. It doesn't matter." Another time he declared, "Enlightenment is not an achievement. It's more like homecoming. An absolute coming home. That's enlightenment." Yet another time he reflected, "It means you just see life as it is. You take away everything, all the poetry, all the investments. and you see life just the way it is. You realize it is multidimensional. You realize that if you don't enjoy the whole scope of life, it's a foolish way to live. There is no this is it or that is it. There is no this or that, and that's that. There is no yes or no, just yes and yes. On still another occasion, when asked about his inner state since that historic afternoon, he replied, "I'm now a total fake. You're only half fake. My personality is totally self-created. It's just an act." "And is there a liar behind the lie?" "No," he replied, "just a lie, no liar." "Then what lies behind the act?" I once persisted. His reply was cryptic: "Wild emptiness." Like all those before him who have crossed that mysterious threshold between the temporal and the transcendent, finding a logical idiom to describe the experience seems to have been impossible. Besides, at the time of his awakening, Juggy was unsure how to explain it even to himself. Only one thing was clear to the young man who descended the mountain: life would never be the same again. It was past 8 at night when Juggy reached his office. He paused. Through the window he could see his business partner seated at his desk. His partner looked up expectantly, waiting for him to come in and explain his 5-hour absence and catch up with the proceedings of the day. The Yezdi engine was kept running. Juggy sat on his motorcycle for close to 10 minutes without dismounting. Then he turned and left, much to his colleagues' bewilderment. He drove slowly around the streets of the city he knew so well. Everything seemed the same. Mysore by night was unchanged. And yet he reached home by 10:30 at night. He spoke little, ate a perfunctory dinner. That night he stayed up in bed until 3 a.m. A week later, the experience returned. He was at the dining table with his family when it happened. All of a sudden, he was blowing his head off. He thought it was for a couple of minutes. 7 hours had elapsed. On another occasion, 13 days passed. "I just sat down for 13 full days," he says. "I neither ate nor slept, nor used the toilet for these 13 days. I simply sat down. Actually, in my experience, it felt only like 15 or 20 minutes. So time was just disappearing in my experience. It took about 6 weeks' time for me to stabilize this and make this into like a living reality all the time. And it took some more time for me to stabilize that experience within myself. There was no explanation for what was happening. His family was as baffled as he. He confided in a few friends who were equally clueless. Some asked if he was on hallucinogens. Things changed rapidly. A visiting nurse from his father's railway hospital suddenly fell at his feet. Others inexplicably started doing the same. As someone who has never touched anyone's feet in his life, this was a bizarre experience for Juggy. Even more awkward was when people started asking him to make predictions about their future. Someone even implored him to divine the date of his daughter's marriage. And yet, Juggy was also aware that he was no longer the same. For one, his appearance had actually begun changing. It wasn't just the general climate of the face. It was, strangely enough, the actual physical features. The shape of the eyes, the voice, even the structure of the body. Others began noticing the changes too. My voice changed. My eyes were bigger, brighter, he says. What accounted for this physical transformation? What had occurred, he says, was a realignment of his entire inner constitution. The 13 odd years of yoga bore fruit at this time. Yoga is essentially a way of recreating the body so that it serves a higher purpose. That's why the system works. The chakras are not static physical manifestations. They are mobile, and one can move them within and outside the system. The science of making a deity is just this. There is a whole technology for transforming the human into the divine. The human body can function as a piece of flesh and blood, or as the very source of creation. The human spine isn't just a bad arrangement of bones, it's the very axis of the universe. It just depends on how you reorganize your system. In my case, from being a physically intense person, I learned to carry my body as if it was not there at all. My physicality became very relaxed. Earlier, all that intensity was in my body. People could feel that. If I entered a room, it meant action. But now I learned to carry my body differently. The reorganization of my chakras also meant that I could be different from one situation to another. To this day, that remains. I can be a totally different person, almost unrecognizable to some people, depending on the needs of the situation. And there was the irrefutable testimony of his inner experience. Life had always been exciting, but now it was rich, intense, simply blazing with a level of high voltage inner discovery he had never known before. From this point onward, Juggy's inner life was always more eventful than his outer. I was now aware of a million different things happening inside me at the same moment. That's how it is with me even now. Even while I'm conducting a conversation with someone, I'm aware of innumerable things happening within me simultaneously. It's like a kaleidoscope, and that boggles people's minds. They don't know how to make sense of you. His father continued to be perplexed by his strange son, whose life alternated hectically between meditation and motorcycling. For his mother, Juggy had already been more of an elder brother than a son for a while. Yet another fallout of this experience was his heightened sensitivity to the feelings of people around him. It seemed inconceivable to Juggy that people around him should be in such states of discontent when his own life was simply exploding with ecstasy. There were times when just the sight of an unknown person on the street in a state of misery was enough to make him weep. Later he was to learn to harness that reaction. An emotional response to suffering is something he now allows himself only on occasion. When I see a broken branch of a tree, for instance, my energy responds to it, but my emotions do not. Once in a while I allow myself the luxury of responding emotionally, but it's a luxury for me. One is still very much open to suffering, but it is no more a psychological and emotional response. 6 weeks after the afternoon on Chamundi Hill, Juggy pulled out of his business. It seemed unfair to be part of something that his new-found perception would help him to manipulate to his advantage. It wasn't a moral issue that impelled the decision, just what he called life sense. Moral codes, he now knew through experience, were merely an imitation of the way life was. It was clearer to him than ever before that he never needed to operate out of morality, merely out of his own humanity. It was easy for me now to read minds and make someone do exactly what I wanted him to do. I still can. But what's the point? It's like playing golf with a 5-year-old. I choose not to. It isn't about ethics. More a matter of aesthetics, he says simply. Even though with the expansion of Isha into various business ventures, he makes it a point to send representatives to meetings rather than attend himself. After he began stabilizing, he realized that what had happened to him was quite simply the most beautiful thing that can happen to a human being. Right now, people glorify childhood because a child can laugh, can jump around, can be happy for no reason at all. But I saw that it is possible to be naturally ecstatic without any reason at all in adulthood as well. And when I saw that this is possible for everybody, naturally I wanted to share it. My whole effort since then has been to somehow rub this experience off on other people. It was now beginning to dawn on him that what had happened so unexpectedly that afternoon on Chamundi Hill was something mystical. Not having read any spiritual literature himself, he had no precedent with which to compare his own experience. Later, however, he would often ruefully remark that his own awakening was accompanied by none of the legendary lyricism associated with Gautama Buddha's enlightenment centuries ago. There was no luminous full moon, no hospitable shade of the peepal tree. All he had around him, instead, was scorching noon heat and craggy Deccan rock. The result, however, was the same. Just as personally momentous, just as life-changing. If the Buddha had spent the following weeks enjoying his state of clarified insight and preparing his years of mission, Jaggi did the same. I could just close my eyes, sit on a rock or under a tree, and that's it. My life was done. After a few days I really thought, this is it. There's nothing more to do. It's over. It was just a question of planning my exit. I thought I'd just be around for a little while, enjoy the whole beauty of it, and then make an exit in style. People who knew me at that time would always hear me planning and talking about when I would leave. They couldn't understand. They said, "You don't seem like somebody who would commit suicide." I said, "Definitely not suicide. I'll walk out. I won't trouble 4 people to carry me to my grave. I will walk into it." And yet, like the sage of the Shankyas before him, he began to realize that this was not a personal discovery alone. Tempting as it was, the role of the reclusive mystic could not be his. His life, so far, had only been in preparation for this moment. Realization had happened, but it was more of a reminder than anything else. It had happened before, but something far more enormous, the Dhyana Linga, had still to happen. It came back to him in a rush, the gnawing ache of an unfulfilled promise. What had occurred was only the prologue. The larger, more significant narrative lay ahead. There was a reason, he now realized, why he had been born into this particular family as well. There were no specific karmic connections, but this was a family that spelt minimal interference with his life mission. For a lot of people, their parents play a big role in shaping them. I had chosen to be born here because it was the family of least interference. My mother had a certain spiritual aspiration. She had been initiated by a yogi on Nandi Hills at the age of 9, and she never interfered in my life in any way. And as long as I passed my exams, there were no questions from my father either. He also realized now why the reminder had occurred at this precise moment in his life. The Dhyana Linga required a certain level of mastery over energy. It was not about physical or intellectual mastery, but an understanding of energy and its possibilities. At the age of 25, Jaggi was at the peak of life, and his ability to manage his energies were finely honed. Without this ability, the capacity to retain the physical body would be severely impaired. Without ignorance, you cannot exist in the body, he was to say later. An enlightened being has to know those tricks, or else he cannot remain in the physical. From this point of view, there are no enlightened beings on this planet. Most are compulsively ignorant, and a few are consciously ignorant. That's all. As for the Dhyanalinga, how was it to be achieved? The technology didn't concern him just then. He knew it was there, that the details would fall into place once he put his mind to it. That's the way it has been with me, he was to confirm many years after. Everything I know happens to me in a moment. When I'm walking on the street, I'm not carrying the burden of this knowledge. People usually become heavy and serious with knowledge. But when knowledge is transferred in the form of energy, not as memory, the burden of knowledge is not on you. When my Guru Palaniswami touched me with his walking stick, what cannot be learned in lifetimes was transmitted in one moment. It is this instant retrieval system which has turned him into what has been observed by so many, a unique living archive, vast and yet curiously lightweight all at once. The urgent need of the hour, Jaggi knew, was goodwill. Memories of all the yogis who had tried and failed before him came flooding back. Memories of his own fierce and futile efforts over 3 lifetimes returned to haunt him. He knew nothing was possible without social acceptance. He first needed to keep the appointment with his chosen band of loyalists, one that he had made a lifetime ago. After that, his mission was to ensure that his guru's dream was not sabotaged yet again by human ignorance and suspicion. and no price was too high to pay this time. He was prepared, as he was to say later, to do anything that men should or should not. And so it looked like the wild antagonistic Juggy was going to build a temple after all. But he knew there was no point divulging this to anyone just yet. Not that time was in abundant supply, for Juggy knew something else as well. Something else that was to give his plans an additional impetus. He knew that he would leave the body by the age of 42. It meant burning the candle at both ends for the remaining 17 years of his life. It also meant keeping all his entanglements down to the very minimum. He had to travel light. And then, in 1984, he met Viji. "My problem," Sadhguru once said wryly in the course of a conversation, "is that I'm far too democratic a mystic." He was alluding at the time to the way in which he allowed people around him to sometimes dictate the course of events in his life, even when his own perception revealed to him that the move was superfluous or undesirable. The remark offers an insight into someone who has lived his life with a strange mix of control and carelessness, meticulous design and flamboyant improvisation. For all his far-sighted planning for the Dhyanalinga, a lifetime in advance, Juggy, the chronic insurgent who lived on the edge, has never quite been lost. Awareness and madness. That was how he once formulated the recipe for the Dhyanalinga. And it has entailed a volatile and unpredictable mix. Seen in this light, perhaps the course of events after his enlightenment is not entirely surprising. First, after a year of withdrawal, meditation and travel, Juggy decided to teach yoga. There was a thirst to share the fruits of his experience in some way. When I saw that you can be ecstatic for no reason at all, even in your adulthood, I naturally wanted to share it with people. That has been my effort ever since. I chose yoga because I had been practicing it from a very young age, and I saw it as a medium to somehow convey what was happening within me. It also seemed like a logical way to get in touch with the people he needed to reconnect with for his mission. It was not easy to win recruits for his first class. As a wild motorcyclist and successful businessman, he was reasonably well known in Mysore. But there were many who were suspicious of the fact that he had dropped out of his business and adopted a seemingly lotus-eating lifestyle. I just sat for a whole year, because simply sitting was the most phenomenal experience for me, he recalls. But that earned me the reputation of being a dangerous person. It took a lot of convincing and coaxing and coercing to finally get 7 people into my program. The first program was intended to be 2 hours a day over 4 days. The second day, the class went on for 5 hours, and so also on the third. Eventually, on popular demand, it turned into a 6-day program. After that, there was no looking back. Later, the program was to be formatted, structured, edited and refined into its current Isha Yoga avatar. but its genesis was with those 7 students who placed their faith in an unknown teacher and took a plunge into the unknown. Juggy was grateful to them for taking that risk. The fact that he could teach was as much a revelation to him as it was to them. On one level, it could be seen as a mere shift of emphasis from motorcycle maintenance to inner maintenance, but it was to change his life and the lives of many others irrevocably. Since then, there has been no looking back, says Sadhguru. Millions of people have gone through these programs now. It has gone through various stages of evolution, and we have now formatted it in such a way that it works for all kinds of people. At that time there was no format. I just taught as I liked. I was never spiritually exposed, nor had I read anything. Even now I am not spiritually educated. That's why people call me a Sadhguru. That means an uneducated guru. He laughs. It literally means someone who comes from within, who does not know the scriptures or the holy books or anything. Juggy conducted his own class for a time, and then decided to work under the umbrella of other yoga organizations with similar objectives. Even if the aspirations were common, he was aware from the very start that none of those he worked with came from the same experience as he did. But working in collaboration had its uses. It enabled him to stay as unencumbered as he desired. I saw that everybody had all kinds of tricks and methods and techniques, but they had no experience. I had had a huge experience, but I did not have any methods or techniques. So observing others helped, because at least it clearly taught me what I should not do. That was a valuable contribution. Realizing what it is that should not be done just by watching a few groups of people who are engaged in various levels of spiritual activity. Some of them have contributed to the Isha programs in their own way. Knowingly or unknowingly, they had picked up something, the value of which they did not know. The same things I picked up and later made into something totally different, altogether different. In many ways, what we do at Isha Yoga is unique. Nowhere else on the planet is the presentation of yoga done the way it is done here. It may be the same content, but the way it is presented, the dimension and depth with which it is presented, is not being done anywhere else as far as I know. He subsisted on his poultry farm rental, ate simply, and lived pretty much in 3 pairs of jeans. He refused payment for his yoga instruction. His usual practice was to publicly hand over the proceeds of the class to an orphanage, old age home, or some other charity at the close of the final session of the class, mount his motorcycle, and disappear for a month. Commitment to a cause could not curb his essentially free spirit. And yet, 2 years after his spiritual awakening, he got married. 6 years after that, he would even have a child. What made the maverick mystic turn family man? Had he forgotten that he was to leave his body at the age of 42? Wasn't this brazenly inconsistent for a man who knew his life had a single-pointed mission? So it would seem. But then again, perhaps not. For Sadhguru's love of life had always been far too intense, even Epicurean, for him to reduce it to a mere game of chess. Most of the decisions in his life, major and minor, seem to have been born of an ability to strike an inspired balance, a wildly dynamic and precarious balance, one that sometimes seemed to recall the dance of none other than the cosmic dancer of Indian myth and iconography, Shiva himself. It is an equilibrium between contradictions, creativity and calculation, passion and precision, recklessness and reason. There are a few times when the balance hasn't quite worked, when things have collapsed, misfired, and his own life has been derailed. But for the democratic mystic, perhaps that is all in a day's work. He remembers the time he first met Viji. It was after a yoga program in Mysore. Viji, a lively 21-year-old, with an abusive marriage and divorce already behind her, had come from Bangalore to attend the program. It was a program with a strong psychological orientation, and participants' emotions were already running high. Juggy wasn't conducting the program, but was invited to lunch. It was past 4 o'clock when lunch was served. He sat down to eat, looked casually across the room, and his glance fell upon her. A distant memory was kindled. After the momentous experience on Chamandi Hill, Juggy's ability to retrieve memories from his unconscious had grown keener. This woman, he realized right away, had been his sister a lifetime ago. She had nursed a deep affection for her brother. But Sadhguru Sri Brahma had left home early and had lived out the rest of his life as a sadhu. Access to him, even as his sister, was awkward and difficult, and her love had never found its full expression. Perhaps it was not surprising then that she should have re-entered his life. Having a brother like Sadhguru was not easy. He left the house at the age of 12. Off and on he came into her life, but he would always leave. And he was mostly a naked sadhu. Sometimes he wore clothes, but most of the time he wore nothing. So there were problems. There was this longing to be close to him, but she could not because she was a woman and his sister. So there were unfulfilled emotions, and those brought her back into my life again, but in a different way. Juggy realized something more now. He knew that he had to have her by his side this time around. She was vital to his life mission. Viji caught his gaze. For some inexplicable reason, she found herself walking over to his side. Even more inexplicably, she began weeping. It had been an emotionally high-voltage program, and no one thought this particularly unusual. Juggy continued stolidly with his meal. He got up once he was through and left. However, that evening after the program was formally closed, he did join a group of participants for a snack. That was their first interaction. A day later, Viji wrote to him from Bangalore. Ironically, she addressed him as her dear brother. She wasn't even aware that she had written it, says Sadhguru. It was her first letter to me, and she wanted to write Dear Juggy, but ended up writing "Dear Brother." I had just met her for a day. She was a young girl, and I hadn't said anything to her at that point. I kept that letter for a long time. Much later I asked her, "Did you know that you wrote this?" She said, "Why would I address you as brother?" When I showed her the letter, she was shocked. She hadn't even realized she had written this. In the letter, Vijay confessed to an urgent desire to stay in touch. The attraction was immediate and mutual. If Vijay was drawn to Juggy's dynamism, his contagious love of life and adventure, he was no doubt charmed by her childlike exuberance, her ability to segue in an instant between euphoria and gloom. There was never an in-between state for her. She was either up or down, laughing one moment, crying the next. It's true that she came into my life somewhat early, he now admits in a reflective moment. If it had been later, perhaps I wouldn't have felt the need to get married. There are many people in my life today with whom I work closely and share a deep spiritual connection. Marriage hasn't been necessary for that. But at the time, marriage seemed to offer the only meaningful context for the two young people to spend time together. Nor was it something Juggy regretted. The whirlwind romance surely owed more to a young man's ardor than to a future temple builder's scheming calculation. A week later, Juggy surprised Vijay one afternoon at the bank in which she worked. "Let's go," he said with characteristic impetuosity. She hesitated. It was only 3:30, and the balance had still to be closed. The bank job meant a great deal to a single woman who had emerged from a difficult marriage. It spelt agency, autonomy, financial freedom, and access to a world outside the home. She didn't even know Juggy's full name at the time. She managed to wangle permission from the manager, however, and the two spent the evening together. Other evenings followed. Vijay attended one of Juggy's yoga programs as a volunteer. The relationship deepened. One day, Juggy called Vijay in Bangalore and told her to join him that very evening. This time, Vijay did not hesitate. She went home, packed her bags, and took the evening bus to Mysore. Her family was, not surprisingly, alarmed. Juggy arranged for her to stay that night at a working women's hostel. The next day, she put her foot down and insisted on alternative accommodation. For the next few nights, the young couple camped on Chamundi Hill and then on B.R. Hills. Around this time, Juggy was to conduct a program in Gomatagiri. In the middle of the program, the two decided to take a 2-day break in Irpu, the site of a picturesque waterfall around 150 kilometers from Mysore. Juggy had visited it often and had camped near the waterfall. It happened to be Mahashivratri, and a quaint village fair was on. At dusk, the two visited the local Rameshwara temple, a small and quiet shrine. The setting was ideal, the light mellow, the ambience made to order, and the two decided to be married. By the Hindu calendar, it couldn't have been a more auspicious time. It was on the same day that Shiva married Parvati. Even if they weren't aware of it at the time, Juggy and Viji were in august company. Shiva, as he says warily, was also to be the only witness to their decision. Soon after the event, Juggy rented a home on the street adjacent to his family home. 3 days later, they moved in. The place had a coconut tree and a sand heap. All that was needed to complete the picture was the sea. That was a minor lacuna. The young couple had imagination and romance enough between them to fill in that blank. Armed with 2 plastic buckets, a few utensils, and the barest furniture, Juggy and Viji moved into their new home with a triumphant air of empire builders. The abundance of love made the frugal material conditions seem inconsequential. I once asked him what marriage had meant to him. Did it fetter him in any way? Did his early failed romance change the way he approached this relationship? "I approach this with a different level of maturity," he replied. "I never saw my wife as a peg. My marriage was built around me, but I never built my life around it. That doesn't mean I didn't love Viji. I romanced her in every possible way, but I took her into my life as a flower, not a peg to hang on to." On another occasion, when I asked what role romance could play in the life of a mystic, someone who saw things just as they are, he replied, "I can look at a sunrise, dissect it, and at the same time enjoy it. If I look at a woman, I can dissect her, see kidney, liver, spleen, the insides if I want to, but I can also look at her for what she is right now. Many spiritual teachers have said the body is filthy, that it is full of blood, phlegm, perishable organs. I know that's all it is, and it is still fine with me. It doesn't take away from its beauty. You're suggesting you have to be blind for the world to be beautiful. I don't see things that way." Juggy's parents were initially wary of the relationship. His father raised the inevitable questions about pedigree, caste, antecedents, and Viji's previous marriage. Juggy replied that none of these concerned him. He was marrying neither her father nor her ex-husband, and issues of caste and social standing had never been of any consequence to him. In a matter of weeks, however, the equally inevitable thaw set in. Sushila grew increasingly fond of Viji over time. The two developed a close bond that lasted till the end of Sushila's days. Viji's parents, for their part, were relieved to know their daughter had married well the second time round. They also grew to respect Juggy's vocation as a yoga teacher. This respect increased enormously after Viji's father, who had suffered a paralytic stroke, was almost entirely cured after attending one of the yoga programs. Viji had applied for a transfer to the Mysore branch of her bank. Once it came through, she resumed her job. Juggy continued to teach yoga. The rent from his farm offered enough to keep his motorcycle operational. The petrol tank was full, and likewise their hearts. Little else was needed. The most important thing Juggy had told Viji at the very start of their relationship was that she had to be prepared to hit the road at any given moment. She was willing. Her faith in Juggy was unwavering. Her friends often observed that she seldom spoke a sentence in which his name did not feature at least 3 times. And so the two lived blithe gypsy lives, traveling for days on end on Juggy's bike, with no fixed destination, frequently sleeping on the street side, in a wayside forest, or on a beach, or in the homes of hospitable strangers. There was a time when Juggy's motorcycle logged 56,000 kilometers in a single calendar year. There was yet another detail Juggy had divulged to Vijay at the very start of their relationship: the fact that he would not live beyond the age of 42. Their marriage came with a predestined expiry date. For Vijay, who loved Juggy with a fervor that verged on the religious, this was no deterrent. To a young collegian who visited Juggy often at this time and regarded him as a mentor, Vijay's devotion to her husband seemed at times puzzling. He recalls how he once offered to help her make chapatis. Juggy loved chapatis, and Vijay was particular about making them just the way he liked. The young man happened to scorch a chapati in the process, and was bewildered when Vijay burst into tears. He had no clue what had provoked such an outburst. But that was Vijay, volatile and highly strung. Her love for her husband was fierce and all-consuming, perhaps even obsessive. But there was more. In her complete disregard for personal security and self-preservation, she was perhaps not so very different from Juggy himself. Both were essentially creatures of reckless self-abandon. In Juggy's case, the spontaneity was tempered by logic and foresight, a latent guru's ability to formulate and assess long-term goals. Vijay's emotional circuitry, however, seemed to come without a thermostat. A year after his marriage, Juggy decided he needed to make some more money. Sitting in a city office and meeting people, thinking money all the time, calculating how can you get a little more out of them all the time, is something that I just couldn't live with. So I dropped my business and thought, I'll start another farm. Already I had one farm, but I wanted something more. I was flying hang gliders, so I wanted a place where there was a slope. Anyway, this mountain madness was always there inside me. He bought a 14-acre plot of land around 32 kilometers from Mysore. It was situated on a hill slope with a Shiva temple opposite and a lake in front. It was rocky, uncultivatable land, an unwise investment for agriculture, or so it was believed. People thought that this was crazy, and it was a big laughing matter in the village. I was a joke in the village. Every day I would do something new, and they'd all think, "Oh, the idiot is doing one more stupid thing." But Juggy proceeded to plant coconut, cabbage, mango, and for some time cotton. He cleared the surrounding bush, devised a simple but ingenious system of drip irrigation, used manure that he transported from the Mysore Zoo, and cut the abundantly available Parthenam grass and used it as mulch. The result? His crops flourished. Juggy's affinity with the natural world has been a long-standing one, and his life as a farmer was an extension of that instinctive sense of kinship. His approach to his work even today is invariably practical and hands-on. He has often spoken of the difference between faiths that look downward and those that look heavenward. The former, he points out, are far more respectful of the earth than the other worldly ones. Those religions which see that God is in the earth, somewhere deep inside, they walk a little more gently upon this planet, he says. Those who believe God's up there, they walk aggressively, because this planet is not so valuable to them. They think they're going to heaven anyway. If you walk through this life thinking too much of yourself, you're a vandal. If you take every step of your life in gratitude, if you see how small you are, you walk on this planet gently, like a pilgrim. This life could be your pilgrimage. One day he decided to start painting his farmhouse. This simple, manual activity unleashed its own share of mystical insights. I was painting my farm building and, you know, I wanted to evolve easier ways of painting, he recalls. I didn't have time because I was painting the whole farm single-handedly. So I would dip and just walk from one end to another. Then I would dip again and walk from one end to another. So for the first smear, I dipped and walked. Here it came out thick. As it went on, it became thinner, 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 and then disappeared. I sat there and it just blew my mind totally, because the whole existence was right there for me. This is all existence is. Something is gross, it becomes subtler, 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 and it becomes non-material. When it becomes non-material, you call it divine. When it is very gross, you call it rock or matter. In between, there are many levels of subtleness or grossness. That's all existence is. He also dug a well on the land himself, with the help of a few laborers. Here again he flouted popular wisdom by digging on the uppermost level of the gradient rather than the lowest. The rock formation in the area convinced him that it would be the appropriate place. It was also more convenient than building a tank on low-level ground and then working out a system of water distribution to the rest of the farm. He found the process of well digging, burrowing deep into the earth with nothing to sustain the digger except the uncertain promise of water and a distant patch of sky above, a deeply spiritual experience. The villagers watched with disbelief when he struck water at 18 feet. It was considered nothing short of a miracle. After some time, he began to toy with the idea of cooperative farming. It accorded with his larger vision for rural uplift. The idea was to give up individual ownership of property and create a collectively owned modern farm on thousands of acres of land and pool resources to cultivate cash crops that would bring in profitable returns. He interested several small farmers in the concept, and the project started to take shape in a modest, piecemeal fashion. I thought we could make a 1,000-acre farm with proper agricultural graduates, take bank loans, dig proper bore wells, drip irrigate, grow about 7, 8 different categories of crop. In the market, if one fails, another would make it. Grade the land according to fertility and quality. The idea was that everybody gets an equal share of it. I tried to work on the concept. I even started writing a document on how to grow these crops in innovative ways. I wrote over 800 pages about each and every crop that grew there. Basically, I believed that if we integrated the farms, then whatever we did would be economically worthwhile. On 2-acre and 3-acre farms, whatever you try to do just doesn't work. And if you grow just one crop, if it fails in the market, you are done. You are back into loans and suicides and the rest of it. But if there are 8 crops growing, you can make some money off another crop if this one fails. And that money is anyway distributed among people. But he was also aware that economic reform was never going to be enough. The real transformation, he knew, had its source in the deepest, often seemingly arid interiority of each human being, where even a distant patch of sky was often not visible. Mere material well-being was never going to be able to access that. Things came to a natural halt when a mulberry farming experiment backfired. Juggy's plan was to sell mulberry leaves to silkworm breeders and make a killing. The crop grew well. Harvest time was just a month away. One day, Juggy happened to mention to his one-man team that it was time to clear some of the dry wild bush around his farm by burning it, but with care. He proposed to do this on his return from Mysore. Some days later, on his way back, he parked his motorcycle on top of the hill and paused, as he often did, to take in the panoramic view of his farm and the surrounding countryside. All he could see this time, however, was charred black land. As he rode on, puzzled, he saw the villagers turn to look at him, mute and ashen-faced. It was the expression one might cast in the direction of the damned. Everybody was looking at me like, "That man is finished." That kind of look, he says. He returned to his land to find the entire farm gutted. His man Friday had disappeared 10 minutes before his arrival, but the terrified wife had been left behind to do some explaining. This was accompanied by much weeping and hand-wringing, but Juggy was eventually able to gather a few facts. The enthusiastic employee had decided to set fire to the bush in his master's absence. In minutes, however, the fire had got out of hand. He had tried his best to salvage the situation, but the whole place was incinerated before his very eyes. Nothing remained to be said. The moment he heard the motorcycle, my assistant had just run into the mountains because he thought I was going to kill him. He had left his wife to tell me because I won't trash his wife. At least he believed so. So she was standing there trembling, and she had taken defense behind her infant child, he laughs. Probably she believed if she was alone, I might strangle her or something. I looked around, and it was totally burned up. All the bank loan that I had taken, all the money I was counting on, all the leaves, everything was just gone. I couldn't help bursting into laughter, and then I knew she would think I'd gone insane or something. I just looked at her as if to ask what happened. I didn't trust myself to open my mouth in case I laughed. She said, "No, no, we did not do anything here. He was just trying to set fire to the bush, and we don't know what happened. Suddenly the whole thing caught fire." As he listened to her tale, it dawned on Juggy that there was nothing more to be done. I had come prepared to stay for a couple of days, he says, but now there was no work to be done on the farm. There was no farm. I was completely free. I just turned around and rode back to Mysore. He dropped in on Viji during her lunch break at the bank and proposed taking her out to lunch. She asked, "How come you're back? You're not supposed to come back for 2 or 3 days." I said, "The whole farm is burned out and I am free." She gasped. I said, "I'm asking you out for lunch. What are you complaining about?" She said, "But the farm." I said, "It's burnt. We don't have to worry about it any more. Every day there was so many problems with the farm. Now all the troubles are over." She was disturbed and said, "But what are you going to do about the loan?" I said, "Right now we are free. We'll see later what to do about the loan." She said, "How can you laugh in a situation like this?" I said, "Okay, if you want to cry, you cry. I'll take somebody else for lunch." Then she finally said, "Okay, if you're not bothered, what's my problem?" And I said, "Now you're getting somewhere." The unflappable reaction to the crisis wasn't just to placate a partner in panic. Sadhguru quite genuinely holds that whatever the provocation, joy is always a very real choice. That farm burning up meant I could just travel for the next 3 or 4 months and teach. And you know, I did raise another crop. This mulberry would have been entangling me for many years. I just put 3-month cotton crops, made good money, and cleared up my loans. Then later, of course, I sold my farm. But I didn't sell because of any financial pressures. It's just I didn't have the time. See, you don't have to be joyful only when everything works out. If you are joyful, you will naturally function at your optimum level. So things work out far better for you than for anybody else because you're functioning at your best. The yoga classes were, in the meantime, going ahead full steam. Juggy had felt intuitively that an important source of support for his life's mission was likely to come from Telugu-speaking quarters. He had conducted classes in Hyderabad. These had been successful, but nothing fruitful in terms of his personal quest had come of it. And then there were those mountains, the ones imprinted on his vision since childhood. The fact that they had always been there, patient, majestic, indelible, convinced him that these were the site for his lifetime's work. He could see them clearly enough even now. But where were they? Did they really exist? For some reason Juggy was convinced they did. He traveled back and forth at least 7 times on his motorcycle, up and down the Western Ghats, from Goa down to the very tip of the Malabar coast in Kerala. In the course of his journey he witnessed landscapes of great grandeur and majesty. But nowhere did he see those mountains, his mountains. Then one day he happened to visit friends in Coimbatore in the state of Tamil Nadu. The year was 1987. He alighted at the bus stand. The bus was early, and he still had a couple of hours before his friends were due to meet him. He decided to wait at the depot. It was just 4 o'clock. The morning was dark, the air crisp and inviting. Juggy sat down on his suitcase. In moments he entered a deep meditative state. He had reclaimed his memories of previous lifetimes more than 5 years ago, soon after his Chamundi awakening. But mists still shrouded some areas of recollection. He had various hunches about the direction in which his mission lay, but they were still nascent, unformed. Now the last vestiges of forgetfulness were banished. As he got up to greet his friends 2 hours later, there were no more doubts. He knew now where he needed to locate his life's work, and where he would find his loyalists. It had to be here. Here in the city of silver mountains. Here in the land that Sadhguru Sri Brahma had traveled so extensively in his lifetime. It had to be Coimbatore.